The blood had frozen to her skin hours ago. Alara Voss didn't remember when she stopped feeling her feet. Somewhere between the third gunshot and the moment she'd crawled over Jacob's body, her nerve endings had simply surrendered. Now, as she dragged herself through snow that reached her thighs, she operated on something more primitive than pain, pure animal refusal to die. The bandits had taken everything: the wagon, the supplies, the carefully saved dollars sewn into her dead husband's coat lining. They'd taken 6 lives in under 3 minutes, efficient as butchers, and they'd left her for dead in a ditch because a bullet had grazed her temple and she'd had the good sense to stop screaming. She'd waited until their laughter faded into the wind. Then she'd run. That was 2 days ago, or 3. Time moved differently when you were dying. The tree line opened up ahead, and Alara's vision swam. Through the haze of hypothermia and blood loss, she could make out a structure, a ranch house, dark and squat against the white expanse. No smoke from the chimney, no lights in the windows. Probably abandoned, like half the homesteads out here after the harsh winter of '78 had culled the weak and the unlucky. She didn't care. Abandoned meant shelter. Shelter meant she might live another hour. Her legs gave out 30 yards from the porch. She went down hard, face first into snow that felt warm now, which her remaining shred of consciousness recognized as a very bad sign. Her fingers clawed forward, digging through ice, pulling her body inches at a time. The porch steps appeared above her like a mountain range. 20 feet. 15. 10. The door opened. Alara's head lolled to the side, and through the gathering darkness at the edges of her vision, she saw boots. Men's boots. Worn leather, standing in the doorway like they'd grown there. Her gaze crawled upward. Rough canvas trousers. A shirt that might have been blue once. Hands that hung loose at his sides, calloused and still. Then his face. It was the kind of face that made you understand why some men chose to live alone. Not ugly. Nothing so simple as that. But severe. Weathered past his years, which she guessed at somewhere north of 30. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had forgotten how to unclench. And eyes the color of winter sky, flat and assessing, giving away absolutely nothing. He stared down at her. She stared back, unable to do anything else. "Help!" The word came out as a whisper, barely a breath. "Please." The man didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, taking her measure like she was a horse he was considering purchasing, checking for broken bones, disease, madness, looking for reasons to shut the door. Alara's vision tunneled. The edges went black, then gray. She had just enough consciousness left to think, this is it. This is how it ends. Frozen on a stranger's doorstep in Wyoming, and he won't even, hands closed around her arms. She gasped as he lifted her, not gently, not roughly, just efficiently, like she weighed nothing. The world spun. She caught a glimpse of the interior, sparse, clean, a fire burning low in the hearth. Then he was lowering her onto something soft, and the warmth of the house hit her all at once, and the pain came roaring back as her frozen flesh began to thaw. She screamed. "I know," he said. His voice matched his face, rough, unused, without inflection. "It'll get worse before it gets better." He was right. The next hours passed in fragments. She was aware of him cutting away her frozen clothes, the scissors cold against her skin, of blankets, heavy and scratching, of his hands checking her extremities, methodical and impersonal, pressing against her fingers and toes with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen frostbite before. "Can you feel this?" he asked, pressing her left foot. She managed to nod. "This?" Another nod. "Good. You'll keep them." He moved away. She heard water being heated, the scrape of a pot against iron. When he returned, he had a bowl of something that steamed, and he propped her up against his arm, strong, unyielding as wood, and held a cup to her lips. "Drink." The broth scalded her throat going down. She coughed, spilling some, but he just waited and then brought the cup back to her mouth. She drank again. Again. Until the bowl was empty and she could feel warmth spreading through her core, chasing back the cold that had settled into her bones. "The wound," he said, and his fingers touched her temple where the bullet had creased her skull. She flinched. "Hold still." He cleaned it with something that burned worse than the broth, and she bit down on a sound that wanted to be a scream. His hands never wavered. When he was finished, he wrapped her head in clean cloth, his movements precise as a field surgeon. Then he stood and walked away. Elora lay there, staring at the ceiling beams, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked what had happened to her, or where she'd come from, or if there was anyone coming behind her. He'd simply acted, saved her life without question or comment, like it was a chore no different from feeding livestock. She heard him moving in another room, a door opening and closing. When he returned, he had a bedroll under his arm. "You take the bed," he said, nodding toward the room he'd just left. "I'll sleep out here." "I can't," she started, but he cut her off. "You can barely stand. You'll take the bed." It wasn't a question. He turned away, dismissing her, and began arranging his bedroll near the fire. Elora pushed herself up on her elbows. The room swayed, but she forced the words out. "What's your name?" He paused, his back to her. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Rhett," he said finally. Rhett called her. "I'm Elara. Elara Voss." He gave a single nod, still not looking at her. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Voss." She wanted to correct him, to say that she wasn't anyone's wife anymore, that Jacob was dead in the snow with the others, that everything she'd been before 3 days ago was gone. But exhaustion pulled at her like a riptide, and the words wouldn't come. Instead, she let him help her to the bedroom, a small, spare room containing only a bed, a chair, and a washstand. He lowered her onto the mattress and pulled a quilt over her, and she noticed for the first time how careful he was not to touch her skin directly, always keeping fabric between his hands and hers. "Thank you," she whispered. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the fire, a dark silhouette against the light. "Don't thank me yet. Winter's not done with us." Then he pulled the door closed, leaving her alone in the darkness. When Elara woke, sunlight was streaming through a gap in the curtains, and she could hear the wind howling outside like something alive and angry. Her body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. Every muscle screamed. Her fingers and toes throbbed with the particular agony of tissue that had nearly died and was now being forced to live again. She sat up slowly, testing her limits. The room spun once, then settled. Her head wound pulsed beneath its bandage, a steady reminder of how close she'd come. But she was alive. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, she was still breathing. The smell of coffee reached her, strong and bitter. She stood on shaking legs and made her way to the door, wrapped in the quilt because her clothes, what remained of them, were gone. The main room of the house was larger than she'd registered last night, a combined kitchen and living space, with the hearth at one end and a table at the other. Everything was clean but worn, the kind of worn that came from use rather than neglect. Rhett sat at the table, a cup of coffee in one hand and a ledger open in front of him. He looked up when she appeared, his expression unchanged. "You should be in bed," he said. "I've been in bed." She moved toward the table, each step an exercise in willpower. "Where are my clothes?" "Burned them. They were ruined." He stood, crossed to a chest near the wall, and pulled out a bundle of fabric. "These were my wife's. They'll be big on you, but they'll do until you can manage something else." Wife. Past tense. Elara took the clothes, a simple dress, a shawl, undergarments that looked like they'd never been worn. "Where is she?" "Dead. 3 years now." The word hung in the air between them, blunt as a hammer. No explanation, no softening, just the fact, stated and finished. "I'm sorry," Elara said. Rhett shrugged, a minimal movement of his shoulders. "Life out here doesn't ask permission." He returned to his seat, his attention back to the ledger. "There's coffee on the stove, bread in the cupboard. Help yourself." She dressed in the bedroom, her fingers clumsy with the buttons. The dress hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, but it was clean and whole, and that was more than she'd had in days. When she emerged, she poured herself coffee and sat across from him at the table. They sat in silence. Outside, the wind battered the walls, but inside, the fire kept the cold at bay. Elara wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her palms, and studied the man across from her. He was older up close. Not in years necessarily, but in the way he carried himself. Like he'd lived several lifetimes already, and had learned not to expect much from the next one. His hands, when they turned the pages of his ledger, moved with the kind of precision that came from having to make every action count. "How long?" she asked finally. He looked up. How long what? How long until I can leave? Something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. Depends. Storm's supposed to blow through in the next few days. After that, roads might be passable. Might not. He paused. Where are you planning to go? It was a good question. Alora stared into her coffee, watching the surface ripple with the tremor in her hands. Where was she planning to go? She had no money, no supplies, no family waiting anywhere. The wagon train had been heading to California, chasing promises of land and opportunity, but that dream had died with Jacob and the others. I don't know, she admitted. Rhett nodded, like this was the answer he'd expected. He returned to his ledger, making notes in a hand that was surprisingly neat for someone so rough around the edges. You can stay, he said after a while, not looking up, until you figure it out. I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. Then why? She leaned forward, needing to understand. Why help me? You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous. He looked up then, and something that might have been amusement touched the corner of his mouth. Mrs. Voss, you could barely make it from the bedroom to this table. I'll take my chances. Heat rose in her cheeks. I'm stronger than I look. I'm sure you are. He closed the ledger. But right now you're also half dead and stranded in the middle of nowhere. So you'll stay, you'll heal, and when spring comes and the pass is open, you'll make your choice. Until then, we'll manage. There it was again, that certainty, that calm assumption that the world would bend to his will simply because he'd decided it would. It should have irritated her. Instead, it felt like solid ground after weeks of freefall. All right, she said quietly. Thank you. Save your thanks for when you've made it through a Wyoming winter. He stood carrying his cup to the sink. There's work needs doing, livestock to feed, fences to check. I'll be out most of the day. I can help. He turned, studying her with those flat winter eyes. You can barely stand. I'll get stronger. Maybe? He pulled on a heavy coat, a battered hat. But today you'll rest. Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor. No, but I've kept more things alive than I've buried, which out here amounts to the same thing. He opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air and snow. There's stew in the pot. Eat, sleep. Don't do anything stupid. Then he was gone, and she was alone in the house with the wind and the fire and the weight of her own survival. The days took on a rhythm. Rhett would rise before dawn and head out to tend the animals, a small herd of cattle, a few horses, chickens that somehow survived the cold. He'd return at midday, eat a quick meal in silence, and then disappear again until dark. Alara spent those first few days simply trying to stay conscious for more than a few hours at a time. But by the end of the first week, she was restless. She started small, making coffee in the morning before Rhett woke, sweeping the floor, washing their few dishes. Each task left her exhausted, but each day she could do a little more before her body gave out. Rhett watched this with the same flat expression he brought to everything else. He didn't comment, didn't tell her to stop or to slow down. He simply adjusted, leaving tasks undone that he knew she'd handle, making space for her in the routine of the house. It was the strangest arrangement Alara had ever been part of. They barely spoke. They shared meals in near silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls or the crack of the fire. They existed in the same space like two planets in distant orbit, aware of each other, affected by each other's gravity, but never touching. And yet, she felt safer than she had in months. One morning, 2 weeks after her arrival, she woke to find Rhett mending a bridle at the kitchen table. He glanced up as she emerged from the bedroom, dressed and steady on her feet. Storm's broken, he said. Roads will be clear in a few days. There it was, the opening, the reminder that she was temporary, that this arrangement had always had an expiration date. Alara poured herself coffee and sat across from him. I want to stay. His hands stilled on the leather. He looked at her properly for the first time in days, really looked, and she met his gaze without flinching. Why? He asked. Because I have nowhere else to go. Because... She paused, searching for words that didn't sound like begging. Because I'm tired of running. This isn't an easy life. I didn't ask for easy. He studied her and she could see him weighing something, not her worth exactly, but her resolve. testing whether she understood what she was asking for. "If you stay," he said finally, "you work. I'm not running a charity." "I can work. Ranch work, real work, mucking stalls, mending fences, hauling water, whatever needs doing." "I understand. And when spring comes, if you change your mind, you walk away. No hard feelings, no explanations needed." "All right." He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once and returned to his mending. "We'll need to expand the chicken coop. Hawks have been circling." Just like that, it was decided. She was staying. The work was brutal. Alara had thought she understood labor. She'd cooked and cleaned and managed a household. She'd helped Jacob load wagons and tend camp on the trail west. But ranch work was different, relentless and physical in ways that stripped away any illusion of gentility. Her hands, soft from weeks of recovery, blistered and bled. Rhett showed her how to wrap them, how to push through the pain until the skin hardened into calluses. Her back ached from hauling feed bags that weighed nearly as much as she did. Her shoulders burned from hammering posts into frozen ground. But she didn't quit. Every morning she woke before dawn and dressed in the cold, pulling on the 2 large work clothes Rhett had given her, pants and a heavy shirt that had belonged to his wife. Every morning she stepped out into the wind and the snow and the work, and every night she collapsed into bed too exhausted to dream. Rhett worked beside her, teaching without words. He'd demonstrate a task once, how to properly pitch hay, how to check a fence line, how to calm a spooked horse, and then he'd step back and let her try. When she failed, he'd show her again. When she succeeded, he'd move on to the next thing. He never praised her, never encouraged her, but he never told her she couldn't do something either. 3 weeks in, they were repairing a section of fence along the eastern pasture when a post snapped under Alara's hammer, sending her sprawling backward into the snow. She lay there for a moment, staring up at the gray sky, every muscle screaming. Rhett appeared above her, backlit by weak winter sun. "You hurt?" "No." She sat up, brushing snow from her hair. "Just clumsy." He offered her a hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. The first time he touched her skin directly since that first night. His palm was rough as tree bark, warm despite the cold. "Post was rotted," he said, releasing her hand. "Not your fault." It was the closest thing to comfort she'd gotten from him, and something in her chest loosened. They finished the fence as snow began to fall, fat flakes that stuck to their clothes and melted against their skin. By the time they trudged back to the house, Alara was soaked through and shivering, but there was a strange satisfaction in it, the bone-deep tiredness that came from honest work. That night, as they sat by the fire eating venison stew, Rhett spoke more than he had in days. "You're doing better," he said, not looking at her. "Better at what?" "The work. You're not fighting it anymore." Alara turned this over. "Was I fighting it before?" "You were angry." He took a bite of stew, chewed thoughtfully. "Angry at the land, the cold, the work, like you were punishing it for what happened to you." She wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat because he was right. She had been angry, furious in fact, at the bandits who'd killed Jacob, at the wilderness that had nearly killed her, at the universe for being cruel and random and unfair. "And now?" she asked. He shrugged. "Now you're just working. That's better." They fell back into silence, but it felt different somehow. Less like 2 strangers occupying the same space and more like something else. Something she didn't have words for yet. Outside, the wind howled its endless song. Inside, the fire crackled and the stew warmed her from the inside out. And for the first time since the massacre, Alara allowed herself to think, maybe I'll survive this after all. Winter deepened and the work continued. They fell into patterns. Rhett would wake first, start the fire, put coffee on. Alara would emerge shortly after, and they'd eat breakfast in silence before heading out to face whatever the day demanded. Sometimes it was mending, sometimes it was hauling, sometimes it was simply staying ahead of the cold, ensuring the animals had what they needed to make it through another night. The isolation pressed in. Some days they wouldn't see another human soul for weeks at a stretch. The nearest town, if you could call it that, was half a day's ride in good weather, impossible in bad. They were utterly alone, 2 people carved out of the same harsh stone, learning to exist in parallel. But Alara found she didn't mind. There was something clarifying about the simplicity of it. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. No politics, no social niceties, no pretending to be something she wasn't. Just survival, stripped down to its essentials. One evening, in late January, a blizzard hit that made all previous storms look gentle. The wind screamed like something dying, and snow fell so thick that Alara couldn't see the barn from the house windows. They'd spent the day securing everything that could be secured, bringing in extra firewood, filling every container they had with water in case the well froze solid. Now they were trapped inside, and all they could do was wait. Alara sat near the fire, mending one of Rhett's shirts that had torn on a fence nail. Across from her, Rhett worked on his ledger, making calculations that she suspected were grim. She'd seen enough of ranch life now to know that the margins were razor thin. One bad season, one illness sweeping through the herd, one winter that lasted too long, any of it could mean the difference between survival and starvation. "How bad is it?" she asked, breaking hours of silence. He looked up. "The storm? The ranch?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't pretend not to understand. "Bad enough. Lost 6 head last month. Feed costs are higher than expected, and with just me managing everything," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It's a 2-person operation trying to run on one. You have 2 people now. You're not—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "You're not permanent." The statement hung between them, a reminder of the agreement they'd made. She could leave any time, no strings, no obligations. But sitting there in the firelight, with the storm raging outside and months of hard work behind her, Alara realized something had changed. She didn't want to leave. This place, this life, this strange, silent partnership with a man who barely spoke, it had become hers in a way nothing else ever had. "What if I was?" she said quietly. Rhett's hand stilled on the ledger. "Was what?" "Permanent." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something flicker in those winter sky eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or hope, though he'd buried that so deep she might have imagined it. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Because I'm tired of being temporary. Because I've spent my whole life being someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's burden. I want to be—" She struggled for the words. "I want to be part of something that's mine, that I built, that I earned. This ranch is barely surviving. Then we'll make it better than barely. It's not your responsibility." "What if I want it to be?" The wind hammered against the walls, and somewhere outside something crashed, a shutter tearing loose or a tree branch giving way. Neither of them moved. "You don't know what you're asking for," Rhett said finally. "Then tell me." He closed the ledger with more force than necessary. "You're asking to tie yourself to a failing operation in the middle of nowhere with a man you barely know for a life that will break you if you let it." His voice was rough, edges sharp. "You're asking to give up any chance of something better for something that might not even exist in a year." "I'm asking to stop running," Alara said, and her voice didn't shake. "I'm asking to fight for something instead of just surviving. And yes, I'm asking to do it here, with you, because—" She paused, surprised by her own honesty. "Because I trust you. Because you saved my life and asked nothing in return. Because you're the first person in a long time who's let me be exactly who I am without expecting me to be anything else." The silence stretched. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the world was trying to bury them alive. "All right," Rhett said at last. Alara blinked. "All right?" "You want to stay? You stay. But we do this properly." He stood, crossing to a cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "If we're going to try to save this place, we're partners. Equal shares, equal say, equal work." "Partners," she repeated, testing the word. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each glass and handed her one. "Partners." They drank to it there in the firelight, with the storm trying to tear the world apart outside, and Alara felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, but purpose. Direction. A reason to keep fighting that had nothing to do with simply staying alive. When she went to bed that night, the wind still howling and the house shaking on its foundation, she slept deeper than she had in months. February brought no relief. The cold intensified, pressing down like a physical weight. They woke to find water frozen solid in the buckets, ice crusting the inside of the windows. The cattle huddled together for warmth, ribs showing despite Rhett's best efforts to keep them fed. Every day was a battle against the elements, and some days they lost. But something had shifted between them. Rhett began teaching her more complex tasks: how to handle the horses, how to read weather signs, how to treat minor ailments in the livestock. She absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge, for skills, for the ability to stand on her own 2 feet in this harsh world. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk, not about the past. That remained locked territory for both of them, but about the present, about the work, about small observations that might have seemed meaningless but weren't. Rhett mentioned that the sorrel mare was favoring her left hind leg. Alara pointed out that the henhouse needed a new roost. These small exchanges built into something larger, a foundation of shared purpose. One morning, Alara found a break in the water line leading to the trough. She spent 3 hours in the bitter cold, fingers numb, working to patch it with materials she scrounged from the barn. When Rhett came to check on her progress, she had it fixed and the water running clear. He stood there studying her handiwork, his expression unreadable. "It'll hold," she said, defensive despite herself. "Didn't say it wouldn't." He paused. "You're learning." It was the closest thing to praise he'd offered, and warmth bloomed in her chest despite the cold. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Rhett spoke without preamble. "My wife's name was Sarah. She died in childbirth. The baby, too." Alara's hand stilled on the sock she was darning. This was the first time he'd volunteered anything personal, and she understood instinctively that pushing would shut him down completely. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It happens out here. We knew the risks." He stared into the fire, his face carved from shadow. "But knowing doesn't make it easier." "No," Alara agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a while. Then, before she could think better of it, Alara spoke. "Jacob, my husband, he wasn't a bad man, just weak. He wanted adventure but couldn't handle the reality of it. When the bandits came, he tried to fight, grabbed a rifle he barely knew how to use." She closed her eyes, seeing it again. "They shot him first. He died trying to protect something he was never strong enough to defend." "You survived," Rhett said. "It wasn't quite a question. I played dead. Let them think the bullet killed me, laid there in the dirt with blood running down my face, and listened to them laugh while they looted the wagon." The words came faster now, pressure releasing. "And when they left, I crawled over his body and I ran. Didn't even close his eyes. Just ran." "That's not weakness," Rhett said, his voice rough. "That's survival. Feels like cowardice. Cowardice would have been staying dead. You chose to live. That takes more strength than dying." Alara looked at him across the fire, this hard, silent man who'd taken her in without question and asked for nothing in return, and something in her chest cracked open. Not love. It was too soon for that, too raw. But recognition. The understanding that they were both survivors, both carrying scars that would never fully heal, both trying to build something from the wreckage of their lives. "Thank you," she said, "for this, for all of it." Rhett nodded once, then stood and stretched. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we're moving the herd to the south pasture. It'll be a long day." But as he passed her chair, his hand brushed her shoulder. Brief, almost accidental, but there. The first real touch since he'd pulled her from the snow. Alara sat there long after he'd gone to his bedroll, staring into the fire, feeling that touch like a brand. March arrived with false promises. There were days when the sun broke through, when the temperature climbed above freezing and the snow began to melt in earnest. Alara would step outside and feel warmth on her face and think, "Spring, it's coming." Then the temperature would plummet again, and the false thaw would freeze into ice that made everything 10 times more dangerous. They lost another steer in one of these freeze cycles, the animal breaking through ice that had seemed solid and drowning before they could pull it free. Rhett took it hard, his face going even more closed than usual, and Alara understood that every loss was more than just a financial setback. It was a piece of his life's work disappearing into the unforgiving ground. That night, she made a decision. "Teach me the books," she said over dinner. Rhett looked up from his plate. "What?" "The ledger, the finances, the business side of this. If we're partners, I need to understand all of it." He studied her for a long moment. Then he stood, retrieved the ledger from its shelf, and set it in front of her. It's not pretty, he warned. She opened it and scanned the columns, careful notations of expenses and income, projected costs, actual costs, the growing gap between what the ranch needed and what it had. He was right. It wasn't pretty. It was borderline catastrophic. We're hemorrhaging money, she said flatly. Yes. How long can we last like this? Through summer, maybe. If we don't lose any more stock. If the market price holds. If nothing else goes wrong. He laughed, a sound without humor. Which means we're on borrowed time. Alara ran her finger down the columns, her mind working. She'd helped Jacob manage their finances before, balancing the household budget, finding ways to stretch every dollar. This was bigger, more complex, but the principles were the same. We need more income, she said. Obviously. What if we diversified? Chickens are cheap to maintain. We could expand the flock, sell eggs in town. And I saw wild herbs growing on the North Ridge last week. Some of those could be medicinal, worth something to the right buyer. Rhett leaned back, arms crossed. That's small money. Small money is better than no money, and it adds up. She pointed to another line. What's this expense? Feed. I've been buying it in town. Why? We have pasture land going unused. It's winter. Nothing grows in winter. But it will. And when it does, we plant hay. Cut our feed costs by a third, maybe more. He was quiet, but she could see the wheels turning. Finally, he nodded. It's a long game. We might not make it that far. Then we better start now. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You're sure about this? About tying yourself to a sinking ship? I'm sure about not giving up without a fight. She closed the ledger and met his eyes. I've spent enough of my life running. I'm done. Rhett held her gaze, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. Then he nodded once, decisive. All right then. We fight. They shook on it, their hands clasping across the table, and Alara felt the calluses on his palm, hard-earned, the same as hers. Partners, equals. Two people against the world. The wind still howled outside. The ledger still showed losses. The winter still had teeth. But for the first time since she'd stumbled out of that frozen tree line, Alara Voss wasn't just surviving. She was building something, and she'd be damned if she let it die. The first real thaw came in late March, and with it, mud. Not the kind of mud that dried in a few hours of sun. This was Wyoming mud, the kind that sucked boots off feet and turned every step into a wrestling match with the earth itself. The snow melted in earnest now, running in streams that carved new channels through the property, exposing all the winter's hidden damage. Fences sagged under the weight of ice that had built up over months. The barn roof had developed 3 new leaks, and everywhere Alara looked, there was work waiting. She stood in the doorway of the barn, surveying the wreckage of a winter that had tried its best to kill them, and felt something fierce rise in her chest. They'd made it, against the odds, against the cold, against every reasonable expectation, they'd survived. Don't get comfortable, Bus, Rhett said from behind her. Spring's when the real work starts. She turned to find him carrying a toolbox, his face already smudged with dirt from whatever repair he'd started before dawn. Worse than winter? Different. Winter tries to kill you with cold. Spring tries to drown you in everything that needs fixing. He set the toolbox down and pulled out a hammer. That chicken coop expansion you wanted? Now's the time. Over the next weeks, they threw themselves into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Alara had meant what she'd said about fighting, and she attacked every task like it was personal. The chicken coop didn't just get expanded, it got rebuilt from the ground up, with proper ventilation and nesting boxes she'd designed herself after studying Rhett's old farming manuals. It's too nice for chickens, Rhett observed, watching her put the finishing touches on the roosts. They'll lay better if they're comfortable, she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. Happy chickens, more eggs, more income. That's the theory, anyway. And if the theory's wrong, then we'll have the fanciest chicken coop in Wyoming and nothing to show for it. She grinned at him, a real smile, the kind she hadn't felt on her face in months. But I'm betting I'm right. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. Then he nodded and turned back to his own work. But she caught him looking at the coop throughout the day with an expression that might have been approval. The chickens, as it turned out, agreed with her theory. Within 2 weeks, egg production had nearly doubled. Alara started making trips to town once a week, selling eggs and the medicinal herbs she'd been gathering and drying. The money was small, like she'd said, but it was steady. And more importantly, it was hers, something she'd created from nothing but effort and stubbornness. Town was a different challenge altogether. Ridgemont wasn't much more than a wide spot in the trail with delusions of grandeur. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses clustered together like they were afraid of the emptiness beyond. The people were suspicious of newcomers, and Alara was about as new as they came. The first time she walked into the general store, conversation died. Mrs. Hadley, the shopkeeper's wife, looked her up and down with the kind of assessment that could strip paint. "You're the one staying out at the Calder place," she said. Not a question. "I am," Alara replied, keeping her voice steady. "Rhett Calder's been alone 3 years now. Awful sudden, having a woman turn up." The implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. Alara felt heat rise in her face, but forced herself to stay calm. Getting angry would only confirm whatever story they'd already decided was true. "I'm working the ranch with him," she said. "We're partners." Partners. Mrs. Hadley's mouth pursed like she'd bitten into something sour. "That what they're calling it now?" Alara set her basket of eggs on the counter with more force than necessary. "I have 3 dozen eggs, all fresh. If you want to buy them, we can do business. If you'd rather speculate about my personal life, I can take them elsewhere." The silence stretched. Then Mrs. Hadley's husband, a tired-looking man who'd been pretending to organize canned goods, spoke up. "How much per dozen?" They settled on a price that was fair if not generous, and Alara walked out with coins in her pocket and the knowledge that she'd made an enemy. But she'd also made a point. She wasn't going anywhere, and she wouldn't be cowed by small-town gossip. When she told Red about the encounter that evening, he just shrugged. "People talk. Let them. It doesn't bother you. Why would it? We know the truth. That's all that matters." But it bothered Alara more than she wanted to admit. Not because she cared what Mrs. Hadley thought, but because she realized how easily their arrangement could be misunderstood. They lived together, worked together, depended on each other. From the outside, it probably did look improper. The problem was, she couldn't quite articulate what it actually was. They weren't married, they weren't courting, they barely touched, maintaining a careful distance even as they worked side by side. But there was something between them, a connection forged in shared hardship and mutual respect, something that didn't fit neatly into any category the world would recognize. She thought about this while working on the fence line one afternoon, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of stringing wire. Rhett was 50 yards away doing the same work, close enough that she could see him, but far enough that they worked in separate bubbles of silence. He'd changed since that first night, or maybe she'd just learned to read him better. The silences that had seemed hostile at first were just his natural state. He thought before he spoke, considered before he acted, and wasted no energy on empty pleasantries. Once she'd understood that, she'd stop trying to fill the quiet with chatter. But every so often, he'd say something that revealed the man beneath the silence. Small observations that showed how much he noticed. A dry comment that was almost a joke. And occasionally, very occasionally, something that sounded almost like tenderness. Like last week, when she'd been struggling with a particularly stubborn gate latch and had finally gotten it to work through sheer determination and some creative cursing. She'd looked up to find him watching from the barn door. "Persistent," he'd said. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation, but yeah, I suppose it is." It wasn't much, but from Rhett Calder, it felt like a declaration. The sun was setting by the time they finished the fence line. Alara straightened, pressing her hands to her lower back, and surveyed their work. The fence ran straight and true, strong enough to hold through the next winter and beyond. "Good day's work," Rhett said, coming to stand beside her. "We're getting better at this." "We are." He paused, and she could feel him gathering himself for something. "You asked me once why I helped you. That first night." Alara turned to look at him. His face was in profile, shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "I remember. I told you I kept more things alive than I'd buried, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth." He was quiet for a moment, choosing words carefully. "After Sarah died, I thought about just stopping. Not doing anything dramatic, just not trying anymore. Let the ranch fail, let the winter take me, let it all end. Her chest tightened. What changed? Nothing. I kept going because that's what you do. But I was just going through the motions. Then you showed up, half dead and stubborn as hell, and I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I thought maybe if I could keep you alive, it would mean something, that all this effort wasn't for nothing." Alara didn't know what to say. The honesty of it, the raw admission of how close he'd been to giving up, left her breathless. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "You saved mine too. You just didn't know it." They stood there as the last light faded from the sky, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and decided to keep fighting. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things neither of them quite knew how to say. Finally, Rhett cleared his throat and stepped back. "We should head in. Early, start tomorrow." "Right, tomorrow." But as they walked back to the house through the gathering dark, Alara felt something shift. Whatever this was between them, it was growing into something that couldn't be ignored much longer. The question was what they'd do about it. April brought rain and revelations. The pastures greened up fast, the grass growing thick and rich. The cattle put on weight, their ribs disappearing under healthy flesh. And the work continued, relentless as ever, but with a different quality now. They were building rather than just surviving, laying groundwork for a future that might actually exist. Alara had started keeping her own set of books, tracking the small income streams she'd developed. The eggs were selling well. The herbs had found a market with the doctor in town who was willing to pay premium prices for certain varieties. And she'd begun taking in mending work from some of the ranch wives who'd warmed to her once they realized she wasn't going anywhere. It all added up. Not to much, but to something. Enough to make a difference in the ledger's bottom line. One evening, she spread out both sets of books on the kitchen table and did the calculations 3 times to make sure she hadn't made an error. When Rhett came in from checking the stock, she looked up with barely contained excitement. "We're going to make it," she said. He hung up his hat and coat, moving with his usual deliberate care. "Make what?" "The year. If we keep going like this, if nothing catastrophic happens, we'll actually turn a profit this year. Small, but real." Rhett crossed to the table and studied the numbers. She watched his face, looking for some reaction, but he kept his expression neutral. Finally, he nodded. "You did this. We did this." "No." He looked at her then, his winter sky eyes direct and serious. "I was managing decline, trying to hold on long enough to, I don't know, long enough for something. You saw possibility where I only saw ending. This is your doing." Pride bloomed warm in her chest. "Then I guess it's a good thing I stayed." "Yeah." His voice was rough. "It is." The moment stretched between them, weighted with meaning. Then Rhett turned abruptly and headed for the bedroom that had been his since she'd arrived. The smaller one, since he'd given her the main room that first night and never taken it back. Alara sat alone at the table, staring at the numbers that proved they had a future, and wondered why it didn't feel like enough anymore. The tension that had been building for weeks finally broke on a Thursday afternoon in mid-April. They'd been working on clearing a drainage ditch, muddy, miserable work that left them both filthy and exhausted. Alara had been using a shovel that was too long for her, and when she lost her footing on the slick bank, Rhett grabbed her arm to steady her. It was instinct, nothing more. But when his hand closed around her bicep, they both froze. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of lighter blue in his eyes, close enough to feel the heat coming off him despite the cool air. His hand on her arm felt like a brand burning through the fabric of her shirt. "Careful," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I'm fine." But neither of them moved. The air between them felt alive, crackling with something that had been building since that night by the fire when he'd told her about Sarah, maybe since even before that. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could smell earth and sweat and something underneath that was just him. His thumb had moved, almost unconsciously, stroking once against her arm. Such a small gesture, barely there, but it sent heat racing through her veins. "Rhett," she breathed. He let go like she'd burned him and stepped back, his face closing down. "We should finish this before it gets dark." He turned away before she could respond, putting distance between them with deliberate strides. Alara stood there on the bank of the ditch, her arms still tingling where he'd touched her, and felt something very much like frustration boil up in her chest. They were dancing around this, both of them, pretending that what they felt was simple partnership or friendship or some other safe, nameable thing. But it wasn't. It hadn't been for weeks, maybe months, and she was tired of pretending. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, to the distant sound of night birds calling, to the careful quiet of Rhett trying not to make noise in the other room. The wall between them felt simultaneously too thick and too thin. Finally, she gave up and went to the kitchen for water. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a dim red glow. She was surprised to find Rhett sitting at the table, a glass of whiskey in front of him, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. He looked up, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He looked worn, like whatever he'd been carrying had finally gotten too heavy. "I've been thinking," he said. Alara poured herself water and sat across from him, giving him space to continue. "This arrangement," he went on, turning the glass in his hands, "it's not sustainable." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people talk. You know they do. And the longer this goes on, the worse it'll get for you. Your reputation." "I don't care about my reputation." "You should. You're young. You could still—" He stopped, jaw working. "You could still have a normal life. Marriage, family, all of it. But not if you stay here like this." Anger flared hot and sudden in her chest. "So what are you saying? That I should leave?" "I'm saying you have options. You don't have to tie yourself to this place, to—" He gestured vaguely. "To me." Alara set her glass down with enough force to slosh water onto the table. "Do you want me to leave?" "No." The word came out sharp, almost anguished. "But what I want doesn't matter. This isn't fair to you." "Fair?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Nothing about my life has been fair. I watched my husband die. I nearly froze to death. I've worked myself to the bone trying to save a ranch that everyone said was already dead. Don't talk to me about fair." "Alara, no. You don't get to decide what's good for me. You don't get to push me away from my own protection or whatever noble nonsense you've convinced yourself of." She leaned forward, her voice fierce. "I'm here because I choose to be, because I want to be. And if the good people of Ridgemont don't like it, they can go straight to hell." Rhett stared at her, his face a mask of conflict. "You don't understand what you're saying. Then explain it to me. I'm not—" He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I'm not good at this. At talking, at feeling things. Sarah knew that about me when she married me, and she accepted it. But you deserve someone who can give you more than silence and hard work." "What if that's exactly what I want?" He turned, and the look on his face stopped her breath. Raw, vulnerable, everything he usually kept locked away. "What are you asking me?" he said quietly. Alara stood, her legs shaky, but her resolve solid. "I'm asking what this is, what we are." "I don't know." "Yes, you do." The silence stretched taut as wire. Then Rhett crossed the room in 3 strides and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was months of tension and want and fear breaking all at once, his hands coming up to frame her face, her fingers clutching at his shirt. He kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning, desperate and deep, and she kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates things," he said. "Everything's already complicated." "True." His thumb traced her cheekbone, gentle in a way she'd never seen from him. "But I meant what I said. You could do better than this. Better than me. Stop telling me what I deserve and listen to what I'm saying I want." "And what do you want?" Alara pulled back enough to look him in the eye. "I want to stay. I want to build this ranch into something that lasts. I want to wake up every morning and know exactly where I'm supposed to be." She paused, gathering courage. "And I want you. Not despite everything you think is wrong with you, but because of who you actually are." His jaw worked, emotions crossing his face too quickly to name. "I'm not easy to live with. I've noticed. I don't talk much. I've noticed that too. And I can't promise this will work. Any of it, the ranch, us, any of it could still fail. Then we'll fail together." She took his hands, rough and scarred from a lifetime of hard work. "I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm asking for a chance." Rhett looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. Whatever calculation he was running, whatever internal debate was happening, she saw the moment he decided. "Okay," he said simply. "Okay, we try. Together, but we do it right." He straightened, some of his usual composure returning. "I won't have you living here under a cloud of scandal. We'll get married, proper ceremony, legal and official." Elara blinked. "That's very practical." "I am a practical man. Also very romantic." A smile ghosted across his face, small but real. "I'll work on that." She laughed, and the sound was bright and surprised, cutting through the tension like sunlight through clouds. "When?" "Soon as we can arrange it. Unless—" Uncertainty flickered across his face. "Unless you want time to think about it. Make sure it's what you want." "Rhett." She squeezed his hands. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "All right, then." He pulled her close again, this time just holding her, his chin resting on top of her head. "We'll make it work." Standing there in the dying firelight, wrapped in the arms of a man who'd saved her life, and then given her a reason to live it, Elara felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind that breaks at the first setback, but the solid, rooted kind that grows from good earth and hard work and the decision to keep trying no matter what. They'd make it work because they didn't have any other choice. Because giving up wasn't in either of their natures. Because they'd both looked death in the face and chosen life instead. And because, against all odds and expectations, they'd found in each other exactly what they needed. The wedding happened 3 weeks later in the parlor of Ridgemont's only church, witnessed by the minister and 2 reluctant townspeople who'd been pressed into service. Elara wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Rhett had bought in town. Rhett wore his cleanest shirt and looked deeply uncomfortable throughout the entire ceremony. When the minister pronounced them married, Rhett kissed her with the same careful restraint he brought to everything, but his hand in hers was steady and sure. Mrs. Hadley, who'd somehow heard about the ceremony despite their attempts at discretion, stood in the church doorway with her arms crossed and her mouth pursed. But Elara met her gaze levelly, and eventually the older woman looked away first. They rode back to the ranch in Rhett's wagon, the marriage certificate folded carefully in Elara's pocket. The land spread out around them, green with spring growth, full of promise and potential. "Feel any different?" Rhett asked. "Not really. You?" "No. But I suppose that's good. Means we've been doing this right all along." Elara smiled and leaned against his shoulder, and he didn't pull away. Small victories, she thought. They'd build their life from small victories. That night, Rhett moved his things into the main bedroom, the one that had been hers since that first night. It was strange at first sharing the space with someone after so many months of careful separation, but it was also right in a way that made all the awkwardness worthwhile. They lay in the darkness, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. "I'm not good at this," Rhett said quietly. "At what?" "Marriage. Being what someone needs." Elara rolled onto her side to face him. "You're exactly what I need. You just have to trust that I know my own mind." He was quiet for a long moment. Then his hand found hers under the covers, their fingers lacing together. "I'll try," he said. "That's all I'm asking." They fell asleep like that, hands joined, 2 people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to. And outside the window, the land they were building a life on stretched into the darkness, waiting for whatever came next. Spring bled into early summer, and with the change in season came change in everything else. The ranch transformed under their combined efforts. What had been barely functional became efficient. What had been dying began to thrive. Elara's chicken operation had expanded to the point where they were supplying half the town with eggs. The herb garden she'd planted was flourishing, producing more medicinal plants than she could process alone. And Rhett had started taking on contract work, helping neighboring ranchers with difficult tasks in exchange for cash or trade goods. The ledger told the story in stark numbers. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were actually making money. But success brought its own challenges. One afternoon in June, a man named Porter rode up to the house, well-dressed, confident, the kind of man who expected doors to open for him. He wanted to buy the ranch. "Heard you've been fixing the place up," he said, not bothering to dismount. "I'll give you a fair price, more than fair, considering what it was worth 6 months ago." Rhett, who'd been mending tack on the porch, didn't even look up. Not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. This is good land, just needs capital and proper management. Now Rhett did look up, and his eyes were cold. Meaning, not me? Porter shrugged. No offense, but you've been barely hanging on for years. Now suddenly you turn it around? That doesn't happen without help. His gaze slid to Alara, who'd come out to see what the commotion was. Or new motivation. The answer's still no, Rhett said flatly. Think about it. Talk it over with your partner. Porter smiled, showing too many teeth. I'll be around. After he rode off, Ilara joined Rhett on the porch. What was that about? Trouble. Rhett went back to his mending, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. Porter's been buying up failing ranches for years, consolidating land, building an empire. But we're not failing. No. Which makes us inconvenient. He set down the leather he'd been working on. He won't take no for an answer. Men like him never do. A thread of worry wound through Alara's chest. What do we do? What we've been doing. Work hard, keep improving, make ourselves too valuable to push out. He looked at her, his expression serious. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. You need to know that. I'm not afraid of hard. I know, but I want you to be sure, really sure. Alara sat down beside him, her shoulder brushing his. I've spent the last 4 months proving I'm sure. How much more do I need to prove it? To me? Nothing. But to men like Porter, to this whole damn territory, you'll have to prove it every single day. That's just how it is. Then that's what I'll do. He studied her face, searching for doubt, but she met his gaze steadily. Finally, he nodded and picked up his work again. All right, then we dig in and hold on. That evening, after supper, Rhett spread a map across the kitchen table. It showed their property and the surrounding ranches, some marked with Porter's name. He's been circling us, Rhett explained, tracing the boundaries. Buying up everything around us. If we don't find a way to expand our operation, we'll be isolated. And an isolated ranch is a vulnerable ranch. So we expand. With what money? We're doing better, but we're not exactly flush with capital. Alara thought about it, her mind working through possibilities. What about the North Ridge? That land's been sitting unused. It's federal land, can't just claim it. But we could file a homestead claim. I could file since I'm not already holding property in my name, she pointed to the map. That would give us another 160 acres, plus water rights to the creek that runs through it. Rhett's eyebrows rose. That's not a bad idea. But proving up a homestead claim takes time and work. 5 years of improvements, continuous residence. I'll live there part of the year if I have to. We'll build a line shack, treat it as a legitimate second residence. She was warming to the idea now, seeing the possibilities. It's risky, but it's legal. And it would give us the buffer we need against Porter. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about a lot of things. She met his eyes across the map. I told you I wanted to build something. I meant it. A slow smile spread across Rhett's face, rare and genuine, transforming his usually severe features. You know what? Let's do it. They filed the homestead claim the following week, and immediately the whispers started. A married woman filing her own claim was unusual enough to raise eyebrows. When that woman was Alara Calder, who'd appeared out of nowhere and married Rhett in what half the town still considered indecent haste, it became full-fledged scandal. But Alara had learned not to care what Ridgemont thought. She had work to do. The North Ridge claim required a dwelling, so they spent 3 weeks building a one-room cabin that was more symbolic than functional, just enough to satisfy the legal requirements. It sat on a rise overlooking a valley that took Alara's breath away every time she saw it. Wildflowers carpeted the meadow. The creek ran clear and cold. And the land itself felt full of potential, waiting for someone to see what it could become. It's beautiful, she said, standing in the doorway of the finished cabin. Rhett came up behind her, his presence warm at her back. It is. You picked well. We picked well. His hand settled on her shoulder, and she leaned back into him. These small moments of casual intimacy were becoming more frequent, the careful distance between them eroding day by day. I was wrong about you, he said quietly. She turned in his arms to face him. About what? When you first showed up, I thought you were running from something. And you were, but not the way I thought. You weren't running from the past. You were running toward something better, toward this. He gestured at the land around them. I just didn't see it at first. And now? Now I see that you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I'm damn lucky you decided to stay. Alara's throat tightened with emotion. Rhett wasn't a man of many words, so when he spoke like this, every word carried weight. I'm the lucky one, she said. You gave me a second chance when you had no reason to. You let me be part of this, part of building something real. No. He cupped her face in his hands, rough palms gentle against her skin. You earned every bit of it. I just provided the land. You brought it to life. He kissed her then, soft and slow, and Alara felt something settle deep in her bones. This was home. Not the ranch, not the land, but this. The two of them together, building something that mattered. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was setting over the valley, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. We should head back before dark, Rhett said, but he didn't move. Or we could stay, Alara suggested. Christen the new cabin properly. Heat flared in his eyes. Yeah? Yeah. They stayed. Summer deepened, and with it came a heat that was different from winter's cold but just as challenging. The cattle needed constant water. The garden required daily attention, and the homestead claim demanded regular improvements to prove they were serious about developing it. But they were managing. More than managing. They were thriving. One evening in late July, they sat on the porch of the main house, watching heat lightning play across the horizon. Alara had her ledger open, reviewing the month's numbers by lamplight. We're up another 8%, she said. If this holds through fall, we'll actually have savings going into winter. Savings, Rhett said the word like it was foreign. Haven't had those in years. Get used to it. By this time next year, we'll be one of the more profitable operations in the territory. Assuming Porter doesn't find a way to push us out. It was true. Porter had been making noise, spreading rumors that Rhett had only turned the ranch around through questionable means. Nothing he could prove, but enough to create doubt. And in a small community like Ridgemont, doubt could be as damaging as fact. Let him try, Alara said firmly. We have legal claims, we're improving the land, and we're not doing anything wrong. Legality doesn't always matter to men like him. Then we'll outwork him, outthink him, outlast him. She closed the ledger and looked at her husband. We've survived worse than Porter. Rhett's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of practice. Yes, we have. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the distant storm, and Alara felt a contentment she'd never known before. This life wasn't easy. It wasn't soft or comfortable or predictable. But it was hers, built with her own hands, and no one could take that away. Not Porter, not the town gossips, not even the land itself, though it tried. Because she and Rhett had learned the secret of this place. You didn't conquer Wyoming. You learned to bend with it, to work with its rhythms, to find strength and flexibility. And together, they were stronger than anything the wilderness could throw at them. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke just after midnight, rain hammering the roof with a violence that pulled Alara from sleep. Beside her, Rhett was already awake, staring at the ceiling. Sounds bad, she murmured. It'll test the new drainage we put in. He threw off the covers and reached for his pants. I should check the stock. I'll come with you. No need, you worked all day in the heat. Get some rest. But Alara was already dressing, pulling on the work clothes she kept by the bed for emergencies like this. We're partners, remember? That means I don't get to sleep through the hard parts. Something flickered in his expression, pride maybe, or gratitude. He didn't argue, just handed her one of the oilskin coats and followed her out into the deluge. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking through to skin within seconds despite the coats. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ranch in stark white flashes. The cattle were restless in the pasture, bunched together and lowing nervously. Rhett moved among them with practiced ease, checking for injuries or signs of panic that could turn into a stampede. Alara headed for the chicken coop, fighting against wind that tried to knock her sideways. Inside, the hens were in chaos, squawking and flapping against their roosts. She moved through them methodically, checking for damage to the structure, making sure water wasn't pooling anywhere it shouldn't. A crack of thunder rattled the walls, and one of the support beams groaned ominously. Alara's stomach dropped. She'd designed this coop to be sturdy, but she'd never tested it against a storm like this. If it failed, they'd lose half their egg production and a significant portion of their income. She braced the beam with a spare plank, hammering it into place with nails she kept in the supply box for exactly this kind of emergency. Her hands were numb from cold and the reverberation of the hammer traveled up her arms with each strike, but she kept working until the repair was solid. When she emerged, dawn was breaking gray and sullen over a landscape transformed by rain. What had been dry ground was now a maze of streams and standing water. The drainage system they'd installed seemed to be holding, but barely. Rhett found her standing in the yard, surveying the damage. His hair was plastered to his head, his face drawn with exhaustion. "How bad?" she asked. "Lost part of the south fence. A few cattle wandered, but I got them back. Could have been worse." He looked at the coop. "You?" "One beam nearly gave way. I shored it up, but we'll need to reinforce the whole structure before the next storm." He nodded, taking in the information with the same calm he brought to everything. "We'll add it to the list." The list was getting long. Every solution they implemented revealed 2 more problems. Every improvement they made showed them 5 more things that needed attention. It was like trying to fill a bucket with holes in it, and some days Alara wondered if they were making any progress at all. But then she'd look at the ledger and see the numbers climbing, or she'd stand on the ridge and see the land greening under their care. Or she'd catch Rhett watching her with something soft in his eyes, and she'd remember why they were doing this. They changed into dry clothes, and Alara made coffee while Rhett started a fire to chase the damp chill from the house. The morning routine was so familiar now it required no thought. She knew how he took his coffee, he knew she preferred the chair by the window. They moved around each other in the small space with the ease of long practice. "Porter's going to hear about the storm damage," Rhett said, breaking the companionable silence. "Let him. He'll see it as weakness. Might come at us again with an offer." Alara set down her cup with deliberate care. "Then we'll tell him no again, as many times as it takes." "And if he doesn't take no for an answer?" It was the question that had been hovering between them for weeks now. Porter wasn't just a businessman. He had connections, influence, the kind of power that could make life difficult for people who got in his way. "We have legal claim to this land," Alara said firmly. "We're improving it according to the homestead requirements. Unless he can prove otherwise, there's nothing he can do." "Men like Porter don't need proof. They make their own reality. Then we make ours stronger than his." Rhett studied her across the table, his eyes searching. "You're not scared of him at all, are you?" "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but I'm more scared of losing this, of going back to having nothing, being nothing. So yes, I'm afraid, but I'm also stubborn enough that fear doesn't get a vote." His mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Stubbornness? That's what we're banking on?" "Stubbornness got me through a Wyoming winter half dead. I figure it's good for at least one land dispute." This time he did smile, real and full, and Alara felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cold seeping in from outside. These moments, when his guard dropped and she could see the man underneath the silence, were becoming more frequent, and each one felt like a gift. "All right," he said, "stubbornness it is, but we need a backup plan." They spent the rest of the morning strategizing, mapping out ways to shore up their position. More improvements to the homestead claim to make abandonment impossible to argue. Diversifying their income streams even further to build financial cushion. Strengthening relationships with the few allies they had in Ridgemont. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something, and something was always better than nothing. The next week brought Porter himself, riding up to the house with 2 men Alara didn't recognize. They had the look of hired muscle. Hard faces, hands that rested too easily on their gun belts. Rhett met them in the yard, and Alara stood on the porch, a rifle she barely knew how to use propped casually against the wall beside her. She wouldn't shoot anyone, but Porter didn't need to know that. "Heard you had some storm damage," Porter said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Offer still stands, might even improve it given the repairs you'll need." "Not interested," Rhett said flatly. "You're being foolish. This land's too much for one man to handle, even with—" He glanced at Alara, his meaning clear. "Help." "Good thing there's 2 of us then." Porter's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to be reasonable here, but there are other ways to handle this." "That a threat?" "It's a fact. You're isolated out here. Anything could happen. Accidents, misunderstandings with neighboring ranchers, problems with your supply lines into town." He spread his hands as if this were all very reasonable. "I'd hate to see you struggle unnecessarily." Alara felt cold settle into her bones that had nothing to do with the weather. This was more than a business negotiation. This was intimidation, pure and simple. Rhett's voice when he spoke was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Get off my property." "Our property," Alara corrected from the porch. "And you heard him. Leave." Porter's eyes swung to her, and there was something ugly in his expression. "You think you're clever, filing that homestead claim, but there are rules about proving up land, requirements. If you fail to meet them, that claim reverts to open territory." "We're aware of the requirements," Alara said, keeping her voice level, "and we're meeting them. For now. But winter's coming again. Things happen in winter. People get sick, can't maintain residence. Improvements get damaged beyond repair." He smiled, showing teeth. "Just something to keep in mind." He turned his horse without waiting for a response, his men falling in behind him. But at the edge of the property, he called back over his shoulder. "I'll be seeing you, Calder. Both of you." After they were gone, Alara came down from the porch. Rhett was standing rigid, jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "He's going to come after the homestead claim," she said. "Yeah. We can't let him win." Rhett turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her chest ache. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, the kind of tired that came from fighting too long against odds that never seemed to improve. "Alara," he said quietly, "maybe we should consider—" "No." She cut him off before he could finish. "Whatever you're about to say, no. We're not selling. We're not giving up. We're not letting him win. This isn't just about stubbornness anymore. He's dangerous. So are we. We're ranchers, not gunslingers. Then we'll be smart ranchers. We'll document everything, make sure the claim is unassailable legally. We'll build relationships in town so if Porter tries anything, people will know." She grabbed his arm, making him look at her. "We've faced worse than him and survived. Have we?" The question was soft, almost desperate. "Or have we just been lucky?" Alara thought about the night she'd collapsed on his doorstep, more dead than alive. About the winter that had tried to kill them both. About every fence they'd mended and every storm they'd weathered. "Maybe it started as luck," she said. "But it's not luck anymore. It's work. It's choosing to fight instead of fold, and I'm not stopping now." Rhett pulled her close, his arms coming around her with a fierceness that spoke to his fear. She held him back just as tightly, and for a moment they just stood there in the yard, two people holding on to each other in the face of a threat they couldn't quite quantify. "All right," he said finally, his voice muffled against her hair. "We fight. Together. Together." The attacks, when they came, were subtle at first. A fence cut during the night, cattle wandering onto neighboring property where the neighbor, one of Porter's recent acquisitions, claimed they'd been there for days and charged Rhett fees for feed and containment. Supplies that went missing from the general store, Mrs. Hadley apologizing with false sympathy that they'd run out of the items Alara needed. Small harassments designed to wear them down. But Alara had meant what she said about being smart. She started keeping meticulous records of everything, every transaction, every improvement to the homestead, every trip into town. She photographed the cattle with a camera she bought on credit, documenting their markings so no one could claim confusion about ownership. And she began cultivating alliances. Not everyone in Ridgemont was under Porter's thumb. The blacksmith, a taciturn man named McCallum, had no love for land barons. The doctor appreciated Alara's steady supply of medicinal herbs and wasn't afraid to say so publicly. And there were a few other small ranchers who saw in Porter the same threat that Rhett and Alara faced. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One afternoon in late August, Alara was in town selling eggs when she overheard two women talking outside the general store. "Heard Porter's boys cut the Calder fence again last night," one said. "Shame what they're doing to that poor man and his wife. They've worked so hard fixing that place up. Porter won't stand for competition. You know how he is?" The first woman lowered her voice. "Someone ought to do something." "Like what? Porter owns half this town." Alara stepped around the corner and both women startled. But instead of the hostility she might have expected months ago, she saw something different in their faces. Sympathy, perhaps even respect. "Mrs. Calder," the second woman said. "We didn't see you there." "It's all right." Alara adjusted her basket of eggs. "And for what it's worth, we're not backing down. Whatever Porter tries, we'll handle it." The first woman, Elara thought her name was Mrs. Morrison, nodded slowly. Good for you. Someone needs to stand up to him. It was a small thing, this expression of support from two women she barely knew. But it mattered. It meant the tide might be turning, that Porter's control wasn't as absolute as he thought. She rode home feeling lighter than she had in weeks, but the feeling evaporated the moment she crested the ridge and saw smoke. Not from the chimney, from the barn. Elara kicked her horse into a gallop, her heart hammering against her ribs. The barn wasn't fully engulfed yet, smoke pouring from one corner, but it would be soon, and Rhett was nowhere in sight. She hit the ground running, screaming his name. No answer. The cattle in the near pasture were agitated, pressing against the fence. The horses in the corral were wild-eyed with fear. Then she saw him, emerging from the barn dragging a saddle, his face black with soot. "Get back!" he shouted when he saw her. "The hay's caught. It's going to go fast. I can help." "No. Get the horses out of the corral. Move them to the far pasture. Now!" Elara ran for the corral, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the gate. The horses didn't need encouragement. They bolted the moment the barrier was down, thundering toward safety. She herded them away from the burning building, toward the creek where they'd be far from danger. By the time she got back, neighbors had arrived. McCallum, the blacksmith, and two of the small ranchers she'd been cultivating relationships with. They'd formed a bucket line from the well, trying to contain the fire before it spread to the house. But Elara could see it was too late for the barn. The flames had found the hay storage, and now they roared with a hunger that no amount of water could satisfy. The best they could do was protect everything else. Rhett stood in the yard, watching his barn burn, and the look on his face broke something in Elara's chest. This wasn't just a building, it was storage, shelter for animals in winter, workspace for repairs. Losing it was a catastrophic blow. "Was it an accident?" McCallum asked quietly, coming to stand beside them. "No," Rhett said, his voice flat. "Hay doesn't spontaneously combust in August. Someone set this." "You got proof?" "Just timing. Elara was in town. I was checking the north fence line. Barn was fine when I left, burning when I got back. Someone knew we'd both be occupied." McCallum spat in the dirt. "Porter. Can't prove it." "Don't need to prove it to know it." The blacksmith crossed his arms. "This is going to keep happening, you know. He'll escalate until you either fight back or fold." Elara looked at her husband, seeing the defeat trying to take root in his eyes, and felt rage ignite in her belly. They'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much. She wouldn't let Porter take this from them. "Then we fight back," she said. Both men looked at her. "How?" Rhett asked. "We're two people against a man with unlimited resources. We're not alone." She gestured at the neighbors still working to contain the fire. "They came when we needed them. Others will too. Porter might have money and influence, but we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "We're actually part of this community. We work with our neighbors, not against them. We contribute instead of just taking." She turned to McCallum. "How many ranchers has Porter squeezed out in the last 5 years?" "Half dozen at least." "And how many people resent him for it?" "Most of the territory, I'd wager." "Then we organize them. Form an association of small ranchers. Share resources, support each other, stand together against people like Porter." The idea was taking shape even as she spoke. "He can burn one barn, but he can't burn all of them. Not without the whole territory turning against him." Rhett was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "You want to start a range war?" "I want to start a community. One that doesn't roll over for bullies." McCallum barked a laugh. "She's got fire," Calder. "I like her." "She's going to get us killed," Rhett muttered, but there was something in his voice that wasn't entirely disapproval. The barn burned through the night, collapsing in on itself in a shower of sparks and embers. They kept watch to make sure the fire didn't spread, taking turns sleeping while the others stood guard. By morning, all that remained was a smoking skeleton of charred beams and ash. Elara stood looking at the ruins as dawn broke, Rhett silent beside her. "This was the last thing we could afford to lose," he said quietly. "Then we'll rebuild." "With what money? The winter supplies alone are going to strain us. A new barn." "We'll figure it out." She turned to face him. "We always do." "Elara." He looked older in the morning light, worn down by one too many battles. "Maybe Porter's right. Maybe this is too much." "Don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't you dare give up now." I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic. Realistic would have been leaving me in the snow that first night. Realistic would have been selling when Porter first offered. We're past realistic. She grabbed his hands, forcing him to look at her. We're committed now. To this land, to each other, to everything we've built. And I won't let one rich man with a grudge destroy it. What if it destroys us first? The question hung between them, heavy with fear and doubt. Alara understood what he was really asking. Was she sure enough, strong enough, stubborn enough to see this through no matter what it cost? Then we go down fighting, she said. But we don't go down without a fight. Rhett closed his eyes, and she saw him wrestling with something internal, the part of him that wanted to protect her, keep her safe, shield her from the hard realities of this life. But she didn't need protection. She needed a partner who believed in what they were building as much as she did. When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted. All right, he said, we organize, we build, we fight. Together? Always together. They spent the next week reaching out to neighboring ranchers, feeling out who might be willing to stand against Porter's expansion. The response was mixed. Some were too afraid, others too tired of fighting. But enough said yes that by the end of August, they had the foundation of something real. The Wyoming Small Ranchers Association, they called it. Nothing fancy, just a loose coalition of people who agreed to support each other, sharing equipment, helping with major projects, standing as witnesses if Porter tried to intimidate or cheat any of them. The first official meeting happened in Rhett and Alara's kitchen on a sweltering September evening. 8 ranchers crowded around the table, ranging from McCallum, who wasn't technically a rancher but supported their efforts, to the widow Hayes, who ran a small cattle operation north of town. We need rules, Alara said, leading the discussion. Clear expectations about what membership means. And we need to be smart about this, added Tom Briggs, a grizzled rancher who'd been fighting Porter for years. He'll see this as a threat. He'll come at us harder. Let him, said Widow Hayes. I'm tired of being scared. We band together. We're stronger than any one of us alone. They hammered out the basics over the next hours, monthly meetings, a small dues structure to fund shared resources, agreements about supporting each other during disputes. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. When everyone had left and Alara was cleaning up the coffee cups, Rhett came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. You did good tonight, he said against her hair. We did good. No, this was you. Your vision, your courage. I was ready to surrender, and you wouldn't let me. Alara turned in his arms to face him. That's what partners do. When one gets tired, the other carries the weight. You've been carrying it alone for too long. Not anymore. He kissed her, slow and deep, and Alara melted into it. The exhaustion of the day, the constant pressure of fighting Porter, the weight of responsibility, it all fell away in these moments when it was just the two of them, choosing each other over and over again. Come to bed, he murmured against her lips. The dishes can wait. You can't. She let him lead her to the bedroom, and for a few hours they forgot about Porter and the burned barn and all the challenges waiting for them come morning. There was only this, skin against skin, breath mingling with breath, two people finding solace in each other. Later, as she lay in Rhett's arms listening to his heartbeat slow into sleep, Alara stared at the ceiling and made silent promises. She'd protect this. Their land, their partnership, their hard-won stability. Whatever it took, however hard the fight got, she wouldn't back down. Porter had burned their barn thinking it would break them. Instead, he just made them dangerous. September rolled into October, and the work of rebuilding began. The Ranchers Association proved its worth immediately. Tom Briggs brought lumber he'd been storing, McCallum offered his skills for the metalwork, Widow Hayes sent her 2 sons to help with the heavy lifting. In 3 weeks, they had a new barn, smaller than the original, but sturdier. Built with the help of a community that was finding its strength in numbers. Porter heard about it, of course. Word traveled fast in a small territory. And his response was predictable. 2 of the association members suddenly found their credit at the general store cut off. Another had his cattle blocked from accessing public water on a technicality Porter's lawyer had dug up. Small attacks calculated to divide them. But the association held. When members couldn't get credit in town, others extended it privately. When cattle needed water, neighboring ranches shared. Every attempt Porter made to isolate them only strengthened their bonds. And slowly, Alara began to see something shift in Ridgemont itself. The people who'd been quietly resentful of Porter's control started being less quiet. Mrs. Hadley's grip on the general store trade loosened as other merchants started stocking goods. The doctor became more outspoken about fair treatment. It was subtle, but it was real. The balance of power was shifting. One morning in mid-October, Elara was working in the garden when she saw a rider approaching. Her hand moved instinctively to the rifle she now kept close whenever Rhett wasn't nearby, but as the figure got closer, she recognized the cut of the suit. Porter himself. Alone this time. She stood, wiping dirt from her hands, and waited. Rhett emerged from the barn, saw who it was, and crossed the yard to stand beside her. United front. Porter dismounted slowly, his expression harder to read than usual. Mrs. Calder, Rhett. He nodded to each of them. I thought it was time we had a conversation. We're listening, Rhett said warily. I underestimated you, both of you. Porter looked at the new barn, the tidy yard, the obvious signs of a functioning operation. When you first refused to sell, I thought you were being foolish, stubborn, but I see now you were being strategic. We were being honest, Elara said. We didn't want to sell because this is our home. Home, he said the word like he was testing it. That's not a commodity I deal in much, but I can respect it. He paused. This association you formed, it's smart, potentially very profitable if managed correctly. We're not interested in partnering with you, Rhett said flatly. I'm not offering partnership. I'm offering detente. You stop recruiting my former properties into your association. I stop making things difficult for your members. We coexist. Elara exchanged a glance with Rhett. This was unexpected. Porter didn't strike her as the type to compromise. Why now? She asked. Because you've made yourselves more trouble than you're worth. The barn burning, yes, I know that was my men. Don't bother denying it. That should have broken you. Instead, you came back stronger, built community where I build empire. He smiled without humor. Different philosophies, but I can acknowledge when an opponent has won their ground. This isn't about winning, Elara said. It's about surviving. In my experience, they're the same thing. He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. Consider my offer. The alternative is we keep fighting until one side or the other bleeds out completely, and I'm not sure either of us can afford that. He rode away without waiting for an answer, leaving Rhett and Elara standing in the yard. Do you believe him? Elara asked. I believe he's calculating costs and benefits, and we've made ourselves too expensive to crush. Rhett watched Porter disappear over the ridge. Whether that lasts depends on whether we stay expensive. Then we stay expensive. He laughed, a real sound of genuine amusement. You know what? I think we will. That night, the Ranchers Association held an emergency meeting to discuss Porter's offer. Opinion was divided. Some wanted peace after months of harassment, others distrusted anything Porter proposed. In the end, they agreed to a cautious truce. They wouldn't actively recruit Porter's properties, but they wouldn't turn away anyone who came to them either. They'd maintain their independence and their mutual support, but avoid open confrontation. It wasn't perfect, but it was sustainable. As autumn deepened into early winter, a strange peace settled over the territory. Porter left them alone. The association continued to grow organically, and the ranch, Elara and Rhett's ranch, continued to thrive. One evening in late November, the first real snow of the season falling softly outside, Elara sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her. The numbers told a story that still seemed impossible. They'd made it. Not just survived, but actually succeeded. The ranch was profitable. The homestead claim was solid. They had savings, community, stability. Rhett came up behind her and looked over her shoulder at the neat columns of figures. We're actually going to make it through winter with money left over, he said, wonder in his voice. We are. How did that happen? Elara turned to look at him, this man who'd saved her life and then helped her build a new one. We worked for it. We fought for it. We refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. You refused to give up, he corrected. I was ready to quit a dozen times. You kept pushing. And you kept believing it was possible. Even when you thought it wasn't, you kept working like it was. She stood, closing the ledger. That's what partnership means, carrying each other when we can't carry ourselves. He pulled her close, and they swayed there in the kitchen, a slow dance to music only they could hear. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the land in white. but inside they were warm and safe and together. The woman who'd stumbled out of the frozen wilderness barely alive had found more than survival. She'd found purpose, community, love. And the man who'd been going through the motions of living had remembered what it meant to truly be alive. Together, they'd built something that would last, not because it was easy, but because they'd made it impossible to destroy. The winter ahead would be hard. There would always be challenges, always be new obstacles to overcome. But they'd face them the way they'd faced everything else, side by side, stubborn to the last, refusing to surrender the life they'd carved out of the wilderness. And that, Alara thought, as she rested her head against Rhett's chest and listened to his steady heartbeat, was more than enough. Winter came hard that year, but this time they were ready for it. The new barn stood solid against the wind, packed with hay they'd grown themselves and feed they'd stockpiled through the summer. The cattle were healthy and strong, already showing the benefits of the improved pasture rotation Alara had implemented. And the house itself had been weatherproofed with the kind of attention to detail that only came from having survived one brutal Wyoming winter already. But more than the physical preparations, something fundamental had shifted in how they approached the cold months ahead. Last year, winter had been an enemy to survive. This year, it was just another season to work through. Alara stood at the kitchen window on a December morning, watching snow fall in thick curtains across the land. Behind her, she could hear Rhett moving around, starting coffee, stoking the fire. The sounds of home, familiar and comfortable. "You planning to stand there all day?" he asked. She turned to find him holding out a cup of coffee, steam rising in lazy spirals. "Just thinking." "About?" "How different this is from last year. How much has changed?" Rhett joined her at the window, shoulder brushing hers. "Almost lost you last year. I remember standing here watching for you to come back from checking the stock, terrified you'd gotten turned around in the snow. I remember that day. You barely said 2 words to me, just handed me dry clothes and walked away. I didn't know what to say. Didn't know if I had the right to be worried about you." He paused. "Didn't know if you'd stay long enough for it to matter." Alara leaned into him, feeling his solid warmth. "And now? Now I know you're staying because you're as stubborn as this land and twice as fierce." He kissed the top of her head. "Now I know that worrying about you is just part of my life, like breathing. Romantic as always. You knew what you were getting into when you married me." She laughed, and the sound filled the quiet house with warmth. They stood there together, watching the snow transform the familiar landscape into something new, and Alara felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what she'd been running toward that night she'd stumbled out of the frozen tree line. Not rescue, but partnership. Not safety, but purpose. Not shelter, but home. The association meeting that month brought news that shifted the careful balance they'd established with Porter. Tom Briggs arrived with his usual scowl deeper than normal, and Widow Hayes looked genuinely shaken. "Porter's selling," Tom announced without preamble. "The whole operation, everything he's acquired in the last decade." Silence fell across the room. "To who?" McCallum asked. "Eastern Investment Group. Railroad interests, mostly. They're buying up rangeland for future expansion." Tom's weathered hands clenched on the table. "And they're not interested in Porter's arrangement with us. Far as they're concerned, we're obstacles to clear." Alara felt her stomach drop. They'd fought so hard to establish their position, to make themselves too expensive to crush. But that calculation had been based on Porter's personal interest in the territory. A faceless corporation wouldn't care about community relationships or local politics. "How long do we have?" Rhett asked. "Sale closes in March. New owners take possession in April." Tom looked around the table at the faces of people who'd become more than business associates. They'd become friends, allies, family. "We need a strategy." The discussion that followed was heated and circular. Some argued for selling while they still could, getting out before the railroad interests made selling impossible. Others wanted to fight, though no one could articulate what that fight would look like. Finally, Alara spoke up. "We don't have to fight the railroad," she said. "We have to make ourselves indispensable to them." "How?" Widow Hayes asked. "They want rangeland for cattle transport, right? Future rail lines, stockyards, that kind of infrastructure?" Alara's mind was working fast, connecting pieces. They need that land productive in the meantime. Sitting on empty range doesn't generate revenue. So we offer to manage it for them, McCallum said slowly, catching on. We're already running successful operations. We know this land, these weather patterns, these markets. We become their local partners instead of their obstacles. She looked around the table. We give them a reason to want us here. That's assuming they'll listen, Tom said skeptically. It's assuming we present it right. Professional proposal, financial projections, everything laid out in terms they understand. Alara felt the familiar fire of a challenge catching. We show them that working with us is more profitable than working against us. Rhett was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That's a big gamble. Everything we've done has been a gamble. This is just the next one. The vote was close, but ultimately the association agreed to try Alara's approach. They'd put together a formal proposal and present it to the new owners when they took possession. In the meantime, they'd continue operating as they had been, strengthening their position however they could. As people filed out into the winter night, Rhett caught Alara's arm. You know this might not work, he said quietly. I know. And if it doesn't, we could lose everything. We faced that possibility before. Not like this. Before it was just external threats. Now we're betting our future on the goodwill of people who only care about profit margins. Alara turned to face him fully. What would you rather do? Sell now and start over somewhere else? Give up everything we've built because we're scared? I'm trying to be realistic. No, you're trying to protect me from disappointment. But I don't need protection, Rhett. I need you to believe we can do this. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working the way it did when he was wrestling with something internal. Finally, he nodded. All right, we do it your way, but I'm going to worry, whether you need me to or not. I wouldn't expect anything less. They spent the winter preparing their proposal, and Alara threw herself into it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She documented every improvement they'd made, every increase in productivity, every dollar of profit. She researched railroad operations and livestock markets, teaching herself the language of corporate finance from books she ordered from back east. Rhett watched this transformation with something like awe. The woman who'd arrived at his door barely alive had become a force of nature, strategic, relentless, brilliant in ways he'd never anticipated. One night in January, he found her still at the kitchen table well past midnight, surrounded by papers and calculations, her eyes red from strain. Come to bed, he said gently. I'm almost done with the revenue projections. You've been almost done for 3 hours. This has to be perfect, Rhett. One mistake and they'll dismiss us as ignorant ranchers who don't understand business. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. Alara, look at me. She did, and he saw the fear underneath the determination. Fear that all their work would be for nothing. Fear that she'd fail the people counting on her. Fear that she'd lose the life they'd built. You've already done enough, he said. This proposal is solid. You've thought of everything, covered every angle. At some point, you have to trust that it's good enough. What if it's not? Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But running yourself into the ground won't change the outcome. It'll just make you too tired to fight if we need to. She stared at him, and he could see the moment she let herself hear him. The tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. When did you get so wise? She asked. I married you, didn't I? That was pretty wise. She laughed, tired but real, and let him pull her to her feet. They left the papers scattered across the table and went to bed, and Rhett held her until her breathing evened into sleep. He stayed awake longer, staring at the ceiling, his own fears churning. He'd meant what he said. Her proposal was excellent. But he also knew that excellence didn't always matter when dealing with people who saw land as nothing more than investment opportunity. If they lost this, if the railroad interests forced them out, he wasn't sure Alara would recover. She'd poured everything into this place, built her entire identity around what they'd created together. Losing it might break something in her that couldn't be fixed, but voicing those fears wouldn't help anything. So he pushed them down and focused on the warmth of her body beside him, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the simple fact that whatever came, they'd face it together. That had to be enough. March arrived with false promises of spring, warm days followed by hard freezes that turned the melting snow into treacherous ice. The sale went through as scheduled, and the new owners sent representatives to survey their acquisition. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday in early April at the territorial office in Ridgemont. Alara dressed carefully that morning, choosing the most professional outfit she owned. a dark skirt and fitted jacket she'd had made specially for the occasion. She looked like she belonged in a boardroom, not a barn. Rhett wore his wedding suit, brushed clean and pressed. They rode into town together, the proposal bound in leather and tucked safely in Alara's satchel. The railroad representatives were exactly what Alara had expected. 3 men in expensive Eastern suits who looked at Ridgemont like it was something stuck to their shoes. The lead representative, a man named Harrison, barely glanced at the assembled ranchers before launching into his prepared remarks. The company appreciates your interest in continuing operations on these properties, he said in a tone that suggested he appreciated nothing of the sort. However, we have our own management plans that don't include maintaining current arrangements. With respect, sir, Alara said, standing, I don't think you've had a chance to review what those current arrangements actually entail. Harrison looked at her with the kind of dismissiveness reserved for women who spoke out of turn. Mrs. Calder, and I've prepared a comprehensive proposal outlining how our association can increase the profitability of your new holdings while you develop your longer-term infrastructure plans. She placed the bound proposal in front of him, and to his credit, Harrison at least opened it. His colleagues leaned in, and Alara watched their faces as they scanned the numbers she'd so carefully compiled. These productivity increases, one of them said slowly. You're claiming 40% improvement over previous management? That's conservative. Some properties have seen closer to 60%. We can provide documentation for every figure in that report. Harrison was frowning now, but it was the frown of someone being forced to reconsider. And you're proposing a profit-sharing arrangement? 80-20 split favor the railroad. You get the majority of profits plus guaranteed management of your properties by people who know this land. We get to continue our operations and a fair percentage of what we produce. Why wouldn't we just hire our own managers? Because you'd be training people from scratch in one of the harshest operating environments in the country. Last winter, we lost 2 ranchers who couldn't handle the conditions, and they'd been here for years. Your hired managers would last 1 season, maybe 2, before they quit or fail. Alara leaned forward. We're offering you local expertise that can't be bought, only earned through surviving this place. The 3 men exchanged looks. Harrison closed the proposal and sat back. We'll need to review this in detail, he said, and discuss it with the main office. Of course, we can provide additional documentation, answer any questions you have. We'll be in touch, Mrs. Calder. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Alara gathered her materials and walked out with her head high, Rhett beside her. They didn't speak until they were well outside town, the horses moving at an easy pace through the spring mud. What do you think? She asked finally. I think you were magnificent. Rhett's voice was warm with pride. I think you made it very hard for them to say no. But will they say yes? That's out of our hands now. We did everything we could. Alara nodded, but anxiety gnawed at her. Everything they'd built, all their careful planning and hard work, now rested in the hands of strangers who cared nothing for this land or the people on it. The waiting was agony. Days stretched into weeks with no word from the railroad company. The association members grew restless, some beginning to make contingency plans to sell and move on. Alara checked the post office compulsively, hoping for a letter that never came. Then, on a Tuesday in late April, Harrison himself rode out to the ranch. Alara saw him coming and felt her heart climb into her throat. Rhett emerged from the barn, moving to stand beside her in a united front. Harrison dismounted and got straight to business. The company has reviewed your proposal. And? Alara's voice was steadier than she felt. And we're prepared to accept it, with modifications. Relief hit her so hard she nearly swayed. What kind of modifications? 70-30 split instead of 80-20, and we want annual reviews with performance benchmarks. Fail to meet them, and the arrangement terminates. It was harder terms than she'd proposed, but it was acceptance. Room to work, to prove themselves, to secure their future. We'll need to discuss it with the association, Alara said. Of course. You have 1 week to decide. After that, we'll proceed with alternative arrangements. After Harrison left, Alara and Rhett stood in the yard, the enormity of what had just happened slowly sinking in. We did it, she said wonderingly. You did it. We did it, she insisted. I couldn't have built something worth protecting without you. This ranch, the association, all of it, that's both of us. Rhett pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges those performance benchmarks bring, we'll handle it. Together. Always together. The association voted to accept the railroad's terms, and by May, the new arrangement was official. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were legitimate business partners with one of the largest corporate entities in the country. It changed things. Suddenly, they had access to resources they'd never dreamed of. Better equipment, connections to larger markets, capital for improvements. But it also meant scrutiny, pressure to perform, the constant awareness that failure wasn't just personal anymore. It would affect everyone in the association. Alara felt the weight of that responsibility, but she didn't buckle under it. Instead, she seemed to grow stronger, rising to meet each challenge with the same fierce determination she'd brought to everything else. One evening in early June, Rhett found her on the porch, watching the sun set over land that was theirs now in ways it hadn't been before. Not just because they owned it, but because they'd fought for it, built it, made it matter. "Thinking again?" he asked, settling beside her. "Remembering that first night when I showed up half dead. Did you ever imagine this? This specifically? No, but I hoped for something, some reason to keep going." He took her hand. "You gave me that. Not just the ranch succeeding, but a reason to care if it did. I was so scared that night. Scared I'd die, scared you'd turn me away, scared of everything. And now I'm still scared sometimes, but it's different. I'm scared of losing what we've built, not of whether we can build it at all." She squeezed his hand. "That's progress, I think. It's more than progress. It's proof that we did something right." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The chickens settled into their roost. The land breathed its evening breath, and they were part of it now, woven into its fabric. Alara thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, desperate, broken, running from death. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who'd learned that survival was only the beginning of the story. The real story was what you built after you survived, the life you chose, the person you became, the home you created from nothing but stubbornness and hope. She'd found all of that here, in this harsh and beautiful place, with this difficult and wonderful man. And whatever came next, whatever challenges the railroad contract brought, whatever new obstacles appeared, she knew they'd face it the way they'd faced everything else, with grit, determination, and an absolute refusal to surrender what they'd earned. The wilderness hadn't broken them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger than either of them could have been alone. And that, Alara thought, as Rhett's arm settled around her shoulders and the first stars began to appear, was worth every frozen step, every calloused hand, every moment of doubt she'd overcome to get here. This was home. This was family. This was everything. And she was never running again. The years that followed taught Alara something fundamental about success. It wasn't a destination you reached and then relaxed into. It was a process of constant adjustment, of meeting new challenges with the same determination you'd brought to the old ones. The railroad contract meant quarterly reviews, performance metrics, endless paperwork. Some months they exceeded expectations easily. Other months they scrambled to meet benchmarks that seemed designed to trip them up. But they met them, every single time. By the third year of the arrangement, the Wyoming Small Ranchers Association had grown to 23 members. What had started as a defensive alliance had evolved into something more substantial, a genuine cooperative that leveraged collective bargaining power to negotiate better prices, shared expensive equipment, and provided mutual support during hard times. Alara found herself spending more time on association business than ranch work, traveling to neighboring properties to consult on operations, mediating disputes, strategizing about market conditions. Rhett had taken over most of the day-to-day ranch management, and he was better at it than he'd ever been working alone. "You know what I realized?" he said one evening as they reviewed the quarterly numbers together. "What's that? When you first showed up, I thought I was rescuing you, giving you shelter, teaching you how to survive out here." He looked up from the ledger with a slight smile. "Turns out you were rescuing me. I was dying out here, just going through motions. You brought me back to life." Alara felt warmth bloom in her chest. "We rescued each other. That's how partnership works." Is that what we're calling it now? Mutual rescue? Among other things, He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses on her palm, marks of hard work that matched his own. I love you. Don't think I say that enough. The words still had the power to make her breath catch. Rhett wasn't demonstrative by nature, didn't waste words on sentiment, which made moments like this all the more valuable. I love you too, she said. Even when you're being stubborn and impossible. Especially then, I hope, since that's most of the time. She laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen with light. But beneath the success and the growing stability, Ilara felt something nagging at her, a restlessness she couldn't quite name. The ranch was thriving. The association was strong. They had everything she'd fought for. So why did it feel incomplete? The answer came on a morning in late August, when she woke feeling ill for the third day running. At first, she dismissed it as something she'd eaten, or perhaps the stress of the upcoming annual review. But when the nausea persisted into the second week, a different possibility began to take shape. She rode into town to see the doctor, her mind churning with equal parts hope and fear. The examination was brief, the confirmation simple. She was pregnant. Ilara sat in the doctor's office trying to process what that meant. A child. Her and Rhett's child. Another life to build, another responsibility to shoulder, another opportunity to fail or succeed. The doctor, an older man who'd seen her transform from the half-dead woman Rhett had brought in years ago to the formidable rancher she'd become, smiled gently. Congratulations, Mrs. Calder. From what I can tell, you're about 8 weeks along. Due sometime in early March. The same month she'd filed the homestead claim. The same month she'd stood before railroad representatives and fought for their future. A month of beginnings. Thank you, she managed. On the ride home, Ilara's thoughts raced. How would Rhett react? They'd never discussed children, never planned for this possibility. His first wife had died in childbirth. Would this bring back painful memories? Would he be afraid, resentful, unprepared? And what about her? Was she ready to be a mother? She barely remembered her own mother, and the role models she'd had growing up certainly hadn't prepared her for raising a child in the Wyoming wilderness. She found Rhett in the barn, repairing a saddle that had split at the pommel. He looked up when she entered, and his expression immediately shifted to concern. What happened? You're pale. I'm fine, I need to tell you something. He set down the leather and gave her his full attention. Ilara took a breath trying to find the right words, and finally just said it straight. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Rhett's face went through a series of expressions too quick to track. Shock, fear, something that might have been grief. Then, slowly, carefully, something else emerged. Wonder. You're sure? His voice was rough. The doctor confirmed it, about 8 weeks. He crossed to her in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. I thought, after Sarah, I never thought I'd get another chance at this. Are you scared? Ilara asked, after what happened before. Terrified, but I'm also... He stopped, searching for words. I'm grateful that we get to do this together, that this child will have you as a mother. The fear that had been coiling in Ilara's stomach began to ease. We can do this, right? The ranch, the association, a baby. It's manageable. Nothing about our life has ever been manageable. We've just been too stubborn to admit it. He cupped her face in his hands. We'll figure it out. Same way we've figured out everything else. That night, they lay in bed talking about the future in concrete terms for the first time. Where the baby would sleep, they'd need to build an addition to the house. How they'd manage childcare when work demanded attention. Perhaps one of the association members had a daughter who could help. What kind of life they wanted to give this child, opportunities, education, but also the knowledge of hard work and the satisfaction that came from building something real. I want them to know struggle, Ilara said. Not because struggle is noble, but because overcoming it is. I want them to understand that nothing worth having comes easy. They'll learn that watching you, Rhett said. You're the most determined person I've ever met. And you're the strongest. Those are good things to inherit. As autumn progressed, Ilara's pregnancy became obvious, and with it came unexpected reactions from the community. Mrs. Hadley, who'd been cold to her for years, softened noticeably, offering unsolicited advice about childbirth and infant care. The women of the association rallied around her, sharing hand-me-down baby clothes and offering to help with the heavier ranch work as her body changed. Even the railroad representatives seemed pleased when they learned about the pregnancy during a quarterly review. Harrison actually smiled, a rare expression on his usually stern face. "Continuity," he said. "That's what the company values, knowing that this operation will continue into the next generation." It was a pragmatic response, but Alara took it as approval nonetheless. The winter that followed was gentler than the one that had nearly killed her 3 years prior, but Alara felt its constraints more acutely. Her body, which had become strong and capable through months of hard labor, now tired easily. Tasks she'd performed without thought now required rest breaks. The frustration of physical limitation chafed against her nature. "Let me do that," Rhett would say, taking the water bucket or the feed sack from her hands. "I'm pregnant, not broken." "I know, but I also know you'll push yourself until you collapse if I don't intervene. So I'm intervening." It became a kind of dance. Alara fighting to maintain her contribution to the ranch work, Rhett trying to protect her without diminishing her, both of them navigating new territory without a map. One evening in February, with Alara now heavily pregnant and moving with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo, they sat together going through baby names. "What about Sarah?" Rhett suggested quietly. "If it's a girl." Alara considered this. She'd been worried about the ghost of his first wife, afraid that comparison would always shadow their marriage. But she'd learned that Rhett's capacity for love wasn't diminished by loss. It was deepened by it. "Sarah Alara," she said, "if you want to honor both." His hand found hers. "And if it's a boy, not Jacob." The name of her first husband still carried too much pain, too many memories of weakness and failure. Something strong, something that means hope or new beginning. They settled on names that felt right. Sarah if a girl, Daniel if a boy. Names that carried meaning without the weight of the past. The birth came on a cold March morning, earlier than expected and harder than Alara had prepared for. The doctor arrived quickly, but the labor was long and brutal. Alara understood in those agonizing hours why women died in childbirth, why Rhett had lost Sarah to this very process. But she also understood something else. She'd survived worse. She'd crawled through frozen wilderness with a bullet graze across her skull. She'd rebuilt a dying ranch with her bare hands. She'd faced down land barons and corporate interests. She could survive this too. "You're doing fine," the doctor said, though his expression suggested concern. "Don't lie to me," Alara gritted out between contractions. "How bad?" "The baby's positioned wrong. We might need to turn it." Rhett, who'd been standing by her side, went pale. Will she? "She's strong," the doctor said firmly. "Strongest woman I've ever treated. If anyone can do this, it's her." And Alara did. Through pain that felt like her body was being torn apart, through exhaustion that made her want to surrender, through fear that threatened to overwhelm everything else, she fought, she pushed. She refused to let death claim either her or her child. When the baby finally emerged, wailing and red-faced and perfect, Alara collapsed back against the pillows with tears streaming down her face. "A girl," the doctor announced. "Healthy lungs, good color. Congratulations." Rhett was crying openly now, holding their daughter with a tenderness that transformed his usually stern features. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Alara, look at her. She's perfect." Alara reached for the baby, and when the tiny weight settled into her arms, something fundamental shifted in her understanding of the world. This was what she'd been building toward. Not just the ranch or the association or financial security. Those were means to an end. This was the end. This new life, this chance to give another human being everything she'd had to fight for herself. "Hello, Sarah," she murmured. "Welcome to Wyoming. It's hard here, but we don't give up. You'll learn that." The first weeks with a newborn tested Alara in ways even ranch work hadn't. The sleep deprivation, the constant demands, the bone-deep exhaustion of caring for a completely helpless human, it was relentless. But the association members rallied. Widow Hayes sent her daughter to help with household tasks. McCallum's wife brought meals. Tom Briggs and his sons took over the heavier ranch work until Alara recovered. "This is what community means," Widow Hayes said one afternoon, rocking baby Sarah while Alara slept. Taking care of each other. You built this, Alara. You showed us that together we're stronger than alone. Now let us take care of you. By the time spring arrived in full, Alara had found her rhythm. Sarah was a good baby, demanding but not impossible. And Alara discovered reserves of patience she hadn't known she possessed. Rhett was a revelation as a father, gentle and attentive in ways she'd never seen him be with anything except injured animals. The ranch continued to prosper. The railroad contract was renewed with improved terms, recognizing the association's consistent performance. And slowly, Alara began to think about what came next. One evening in late May, with Sarah asleep in her cradle and the windows open to let in the warm breeze, Alara broached a subject she'd been considering for months. "I want to expand the association," she said. "Not just ranchers, other small business owners, merchants, craftspeople, anyone trying to make it on their own in this territory." Rhett looked up from the supply list he'd been working on. "That's ambitious." "Everything we've done has been ambitious. This is just the next step." "You're talking about creating something bigger than a rancher's cooperative. You're talking about an economic alliance. I'm talking about building something that lasts beyond us, something Sarah and her generation can benefit from." Alara leaned forward. "The railroad taught us that individual operations are vulnerable, but collective strength? That's sustainable. And you think you can organize that while running a ranch and raising a child?" "I think we can organize it together, same way we've done everything else." Rhett was quiet, thinking it through. Then he nodded. "All right, but we start small. Pilot program with a few businesses, see how it works, then expand if it proves viable." "Deal." They shook on it, a familiar ritual that had sealed every major decision they'd made together. And as Alara looked at her husband across the table, their daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, the ranch prospering outside their windows, she felt something she'd never quite experienced before. Completion. Not the kind of completion that meant the work was done. There would always be more work. But the kind that meant she'd found what she'd been searching for. That night she'd stumbled out of the frozen tree line. Purpose. Partnership. Home. The woman who'd run barefoot through snow with death at her heels was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who'd learned that survival was only the beginning. The real work came after, in building, growing, creating something that mattered. The years continued to unfold, each bringing new challenges and new victories. Sarah grew into a fierce, intelligent child who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both her parents: Rhett's steady determination and Alara's strategic mind. The economic alliance Alara had proposed became reality, expanding the association's influence throughout the territory. By the time Sarah was 5, the Calder Ranch had become something more than a ranch. It was a symbol of what could be achieved through stubborn refusal to surrender, through partnership that valued both people equally, through the willingness to keep building even when building seemed impossible. One evening, Alara stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same spot where she and Rhett had built the homestead cabin years ago. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Behind her, she could hear Sarah's laughter as Rhett chased her through the meadow. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain and loss that had driven her into the wilderness, the near death that had led to salvation, the slow, difficult process of building a life from nothing. Every scar she carried told a story. The faint line across her temple from the bullet that had grazed her skull, the calluses on her hands from years of hard work, the stretch marks from carrying Sarah. None of them were beautiful by conventional standards, but Alara wore them with pride because they were proof. Proof that she'd survived. Proof that she'd fought. Proof that she'd built something worth protecting. "Mama," Sarah called, "come see what Papa and I found." Alara turned toward her family, toward the life she'd created through sheer force of will and stubborn hope. The wilderness hadn't broken her. Instead, it had given her the space to become who she was always meant to be. Not someone's daughter, not someone's wife defined by relationship to others. Just Alara, rancher, organizer, mother, partner. Woman who'd looked death in the face and chosen life instead. And that, she thought, as she walked down the hill toward her husband and daughter, toward the house they'd built, and the land they'd tamed and the future they were creating, that was more than enough. The wilderness had tested her and found her worthy, and in return, she'd planted roots so deep that nothing could tear them free. This was home. This was family. This was everything she'd fought for and everything she'd become. And she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. In the growing darkness, lights began to appear in the windows of the house. Warm, welcoming, permanent. Alara reached Rhett and Sarah, and together they walked toward that light. 3 people bound by choice and love, and the shared understanding that the best things in life were the ones you had to fight for. Behind them, the land settled into night. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities to prove that they belonged here. And Alara would meet those challenges the same way she'd met everything else, with determination, with strategy, with the absolute refusal to surrender what she'd earned. Because that's what survival looked like after you'd made it through the worst. Not just enduring, but thriving. Not just living, but building something that would outlast you. The woman who'd arrived at this ranch half dead and desperate had become someone else entirely. Someone strong enough to protect what she'd built, wise enough to know when to ask for help, brave enough to keep reaching for more. And in the end, that transformation, from victim to survivor to builder, was the real story. Not the obstacles she'd overcome, but what she'd chosen to create afterward. That was the lesson this land had taught her. That was the gift the wilderness had given. Survival was only the beginning. What mattered was what you built after. And Alara Calder had built something that would last.